He was the symbol of hope for a generation. George Reeves wasn't just playing Superman, to millions of children, he was Superman. Strong, noble, invincible. But when the man behind the cape died suddenly in 1959, the truth was far more tragic than any script ever written. There were no massive crowds. No Hollywood tributes. No fanfare. At his funeral, the red carpet stayed rolled up, and only a few somber faces gathered to say goodbye. How could the man who once embodied America's greatest hero be laid to rest with barely a whisper? What really happened to George Reeves, and why was he abandoned by the town he helped build? It was quiet, eerily quiet, for a man once adored by millions. How could someone who had become a household name, who wore the red cape and gave children hope, be sent off with barely a whisper? Was it just a case of bad timing? Or were there darker, hidden forces at play, reasons no one dared speak out loud? The man behind the mask of Superman deserved a hero's farewell. Instead, George Reeves was met with silence, distance, and a haunting absence of love when he needed it most. Why did the world turn its back on its Superman? And what truly became of the man beneath the cape? George Reeves, the original Superman, was born on January 5, 1914, in Woolstock, Iowa. He entered the world as George Kiefer Brewer, a name quickly overshadowed by turbulence. His parents separated not long after his birth, and George spent his early years on the move with his mother. From the fields of Kentucky to the towns of Illinois and finally to the golden promise of California, his childhood was marked by instability and constant change. Yet somewhere in that struggle, a performer was born, one who would one day become the face of strength, truth, and justice. But behind the scenes, his journey was far more painful than heroic. And what followed after his rise would break even the strongest man. When George and his mother settled in California, life seemed to promise a fresh start. Helen, his mother, married a man named Frank Besselo, who adopted George and gave him a new name, George Besselo. But that chapter, like many before it, ended in heartbreak. The marriage didn't last, and Helen, for reasons still unclear, told young George that Frank had died. It wasn't until years later that George learned the truth: Frank was still alive. That emotional betrayal left a scar, a silent burden George carried deep within. The weight of identity, loss, and confusion haunted him long before Hollywood would ever call his name. Yet even in the chaos, George found his purpose in performance. In school, he was drawn to the stage, where his voice and presence became his escape. After graduating high school, he attended Pasadena Junior College and later joined the prestigious Pasadena Playhouse, an acting school where countless stars were born. It was there that George honed his craft and also met Eleanora Needles, whom he would marry in 1940. But just like the promises of his childhood, that marriage too would fade, ending in divorce a decade later. Despite his personal storms, 1939 brought a spark of light. George landed a minor but noticeable role in Gone with the Wind. Though brief, it was enough to catch Hollywood's attention. Warner Brothers came calling, offering him a contract, and with it came a transformation. He officially changed his name to George Reeves. The man who once carried the confusion of two surnames was now ready to carve out a legacy of his own. But even as fame approached, the shadows of his past were never far behind. Over the next few years, he stayed busy. There were, however, not many good movies with him in them, and the ones that did well should have helped his career. After that, George signed with 20th Century Fox, but the deal didn't last long either. But in 1942, he was cast in a war play. We Happily Hail, which gave him a new idea. He chose to join the army. When he joined the U.S. Army in early 1943, he was sent to the Army Air Forces. He played the lead role in the play Winged Victory and was also in the movie version and made training videos for soldiers. George went back to Hollywood after the war was over. However, he wasn't given many jobs, and the business was changing all the time. That's right, he took any job that was offered to him, even small parts in movies. In order to make ends meet, he also dug cesspits at one point. George was asked to play Superman in a new TV show in 1951. He wasn't really excited about it at first because TV wasn't as recognized back then as it is now. But the show was a big hit, and George became famous because of it. But there were some bad things about the win as well. Because of this, George became so linked to the part of Superman that no one remembered his other roles. Because of his job, he couldn't work on other projects. Plans to come back failed. In the late 1950s, things were tough for George Reeves. People loved him as Superman, but he couldn't get rid of the role. He looked like the Man of Steel to most casting directors, who couldn't tell him from anyone else. He was over the top, and Hollywood stopped giving him serious parts no matter how hard they tried. Besides that, he was upset that he wasn't getting paid enough for such a big and difficult job. To be honest, George wanted to be able to be more creative and get away from the idea of Superman. He made a plan to make his TV show. He wrote the story and gave it the name Port of Entry. His plan was to film the show in Hawaii and Mexico, among other places, to give it an exciting, global feel. George's side of the story was a plan that was both inspiring and big. The idea was only planned, though, because no one was willing to give money for it. At the same time, things were hard for the Adventures of Superman team as well. They were not able to find someone suitable to replace George. Then they allegedly made him a much better offer to come back, $5,000 a week, which was a lot of money at the time, especially since they only kept records for a few weeks a year. George chose to come back, even though it made him feel bad because he had no other choice and was having money problems. In 1959, almost everything was ready for the new season to start. The writers were working on new scripts, the players were getting together, and the costumes were being changed. At 45 years old, George still wasn't sure if he was Superman. He was supposedly going to start filming soon, but he was a little hesitant. What did happen, though, was surprising. George Reeves died suddenly before the movie could begin. The news shocked people in the entertainment business. Millions of people watched Superman on TV, but the happy, smiling Superman was no longer around. And the fact that his death was not clear from the start was there. Some people thought he had killed himself, while others thought he had killed himself. The whispers never stopped. Nothing good came out of it, it turned into a tragedy. George Reeves is the name that is still being talked about after what happened. Those last few days of his life were full of sadness and unmet hopes. All of this terrible stuff happened just as he was getting ready for one more show as the Man of Steel. Engagement, job goals, and money problems. By 1958, George Reeves's personal life as well as his work life were both going through great changes. He had just broken up with Tony Manx, who is married to Eddie Manx, a powerful executive at MGM. Then George proposed to Leonore Lemon, a lady who was known for her wild personality and high-class way of life. Not long after they broke up, they were said to be going to get married on June 19, 1959, and then go on a honeymoon to Tijuana. From the outside, George looked like he was ready to start over. A new marriage, maybe a job, and maybe the start of a new part of your life. But things were very different when they were alone. We need to find out what happened behind the scenes. George told his closest friends and even his mother that he was having money troubles. The amount of money people thought he was making was not what he actually had. Taking the Superman TV show as an example, he is famous, but the pay isn't very good by Hollywood standards, and he could only work a few weeks a year because of the shooting schedule. George was still hopeful, though. The show gave him hope that Adventures of Superman could come back, and that was the light at the end of the tunnel that kept him going. Besides that, he was also trying to move on to directing. Phyllis Coates, who played Lois Lane at the start of the series, helped George bring this project to life. He thought that this project would be the one that would finally free him from the Superman character that had become his. And could give him a new start. His plans to start the project were thwarted when the money didn't come through. It was clear that he had other opportunities, but they were all linked to Superman again. In July, there was a Superman stage show planned, and it was being talked about whether to take the show on tour in Australia. Yet, those jobs were the ones that could still make George think about how he couldn't get out of the cave. When he was 45 years old, they may have helped him with his money, but he was still in a tough spot because he wasn't popular anymore and wasn't free either. He was loved by many as Superman, but he didn't want to play this part forever. George Reeves had a lot of goals, but things were actually a lot more difficult for him, and it looked like it was starting to make him unhappy. The person in the cape. People who loved George Reeves always said nice things about his role as Superman, even though he was tired of being known only as that figure. Most of the time, people would talk about how nice, respectful, and down-to-earth he was. He seemed to be one of the few men in the show business who wasn't too full of himself. A lot of his cast and crew thought he was more than just Superman on TV. He was a really nice person when he wasn't on TV. Honest George, the people's friend, was written on a sign hanging on George's dressing room door. He was the right fit for that kind of nickname. He was nice to everyone at the studio, from the people who ran the business to the people who worked there. He always had a smile on his face and was willing to help. Kids loved him so much and only wanted to see him as Superman. George knew that kids saw him as a hero, and he didn't take it lightly. George was also given the honorary title of Kentucky Colonel while he was on a new adventure presenting the show in the southern U.S. For him, it was very important, even though it was just a joke. The props department had changed the words on his dressing room sign when he got back to the studio. It was brand new. George, who is honest and goes by the name Colonel Reeves. This was a small moment that showed how much people liked him and how eager he was to be seen as more than just a guy in a cape. That sign wasn't a joke or a nickname at all. It was talking about the real person behind Superman. And George wanted people to know about his other skills, not just as an entertainer but also as a person. It's also important to note that his kindness, modesty, and overall pleasant personality will be remembered by everyone who had the chance to work with him, even though he had problems with his job in later years. Eventually, George Reeves may have been the one who played Superman for most people, but to those close to him, he was just George, an honest man who was a role model off-screen. George Reeves was more than just a TV hero. He also tried to live like one in real life. He knew that being Superman meant taking on a lot of duty, since so many kids looked up to him. That was important to him. For starts, George never smoked in front of kids or cameras, even though he did it behind closed doors. He knew that kids thought he was Superman. Even though he was still popular, he wasn't getting many real acting jobs. He didn't want to be a bad model. He finally stopped smoking for good, in part because young fans cared so much about how he looked. George also kept his private life very quiet. Kids didn't want any scandals or bad news to change how they saw him. Always warm and friendly when he went out in public, he took time to meet and greet kids who loved him. He didn't stop there, though. George also fought for good reasons. He tried to bring attention to and raise money for myasthenia gravis, a serious muscle disease. From 1955 to 1957, he was the national chairman of the Myasthenia Gravis Foundation. His desire to use his fame for good was clear in that part. George Reeves cared deeply about people, especially children. He wasn't just a TV figure to them. He was a real-life hero who made people kind, strong, and hopeful. The death of George Reeves. There was a terrible accident on the night of June 16, 1959, that will always be linked to the name George Reeves. Between 1:30 and 2 a.m., the actor's dead body was found in the bedroom of his Los Angeles home in Benedict Canyon. He had been shot in the head. He was only 45 years old. It turned out that George wasn't the only one in the house at the time. Leonore Lemon, who is going to marry him, and some friends were downstairs. Leonore said she was in the living room when the gun went off. A friend of George's, Fred Crane, told a very different story. He said that someone had told him that Leonore was much closer to the bedroom when it happened. People say that Leonore rushed downstairs after the shooting and kept saying, "Tell them I was down here. Tell them I was down here." Many people questioned whether or not that line was true. The police found that the death was caused by suicide. Even though a lot of strange things made people question the choice. The first thing that needs to be said is that there were no fingerprints on the gun that was found. Besides that, there was no gunpowder on George's hands. But the cops might not have been very thorough at that time. Even stranger, the bullet that killed him was found in the ceiling, and 2 more were found on the floor. All of them came from the gun at his feet, but no one in the house remembered hearing more than one. There were no signs of a fight or break-in. Authorities, the autopsy, and the comments of witnesses have all led the police to believe that the death was caused by suicide. But a lot of fans and even some friends were still not convinced. After a while, Leonore said that George was very sad. She told him that he had no chance of getting a job. He had tried more than once to beat Superman, but he wasn't successful. A quote from her was used in a police report: "He's probably going to go shoot himself." A gunshot was then heard, and she is said to have said again, "See there, I told you so." George Reeves was buried at the Mountain View Cemetery in Altadena, California. The riddle of his death was caused by a number of things, but he was still honored after he died. For his work on TV, he got a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 1960. It was only right that DC Comics honored him as one of the 50 people who made DC great in 1985. He gave millions of people their love of Superman. There is doubt, drama, and a Hollywood secret. When George Reeves' body was found, some people weren't sure if he had killed himself. His mother, Helen Basolo, was the first person who really didn't believe this. She was sure her son would never have done something like that. She said that the cops had not paid enough attention to the case to figure out if it was suicide or not. She even hired a well-known lawyer named Jerry Giesler to look into the case further. With Gellier in charge, a second autopsy was done on George's body. The results were mostly the same as the first one, but there were some new things that were found. People who work in medicine this time said that George had several bruises on his body and head. Bruising that wasn't explained well. That fact made the mystery even stronger. After looking for about a month, there was still no solid proof of a crime, and Giesler slowly stopped supporting the original decision. His belief was that George himself had fired the gun, so he left the case. The fake did not go away, though. Even so, some people in Hollywood weren't really sold on the suicide story. No one in Hollywood believed the suicide story. Alan Ladd and Gig Young, 2 famous actors, did not believe the official version either. Then there was the issue of Eddie Manx, who was an executive at MGM and had a lot of power. Rory Calhoun was one of George's best friends. Some people thought that George's relationship with Eddie's wife, Toni Manx, might have turned into something more sinister. The book Hollywood Kryptonite by Sam Kastner and Nancy Schoenberger says that there were rumors that Eddie Manx was joking around with the mafia, so they may have had George killed to hide the truth or get back at him. When George broke up with Toni Manx and decided to marry Leonore Lemon, things got even more complicated. People magazine's June 2025 issue says that this sudden change may have been what caused the situation to explode. Today, George Reeves' death is still the talk of the town in Hollywood. While everyone is desperately trying to figure out what happened, some say he was hurting inside and no one knew. Others are sure that the latest news about his fame, heartbreak, and betrayal was just a mask that covered what was really going on behind closed doors. Why no one showed up to his funeral? When George Reeves died, everyone was waiting for a traditional Hollywood funeral. They thought he was their Superman, but that wasn't to be. His funeral, which took place at the Wayside Chapel of the Gates Funeral Home in Los Angeles on July 1, 1959, was very private. Only close friends, such as Noel Neill, Don Doerr, and Gig Young, were there. There wasn't a single big Hollywood star or news outlet that mentioned it, so why did Hollywood pretty much ignore Superman? Many people in the business say it was out of fear. Reeves's death was shrouded in scandal and rumors of murder. He was seeing Toni Manx, wife of powerful MGM messenger Eddie Manx, who was said to have ties to the mafia. There were rumors that his death wasn't suicide, and everyone was afraid of upsetting Hollywood's powerful people. Friends in the business said that not only weren't many people there, they were actively told not to. A few insiders now say that it was pretty clear that people shouldn't come, so instead of a ceremony full of famous people, it was a dull, whispery one. When you think about it, silence is deafening. Hollywood not only mourned George Reeves's death, but it also stayed out of the public eye as if afraid of speaking out or being seen, lest the unwanted spotlight shine on them. His funeral was a metaphor for how quickly fame and devotion fade when the story gets complicated. Fear, shame, and eraser, not just grief, kept people away. Hollywood had given up on its own Superman. A movie called Hollywoodland, which came out in 2006 and starred Ben Affleck as George Reeves, sparked interest in the case again. Adrien Brody played a character named Louis Simo, a private investigator hired by George's mother. Simo was a character, and his personality was not the same as that of the real detective Milo Spirigio, but it was based on him. Diane Lane played Tony Manx. In a way, the movie turned into telling the story with a variety of statistics and a few fiction in addition to exploring quite a few various theories approximately how Reeves might have been killed. It did no longer try to convince the audience that one unique principle is proper, but rather it showed specific options. Each one pleading the case for being the complicating element and the general confusion of the whole story. One feasible rationalization turned into that George were by accident shot by way of his fiancée Leonore Lemon throughout a drunken argument. An exclusive thesis stated that Eddie Manx, the husband of Tony and the most powerful guy in that place, might be the one who ordered the killing of George. Accordingly, revenge for Tony, who left the affair with him. The third version provided Tony as the person that made the flow due to the fact she became not everyday and became jealous that nobody wanted her, so she broke into the house through the non-public entrance, which she nevertheless knew from the beyond. Furthermore, the ultimate speculation became the maximum popular of all, and it became that the deeply depressed George, who felt like an entire failure each in his non-public existence and paintings, decided to quit all of it himself. The film leans closer to suicide because the maximum likely explanation, but does so in a way that feels tragic and thought-provoking. Adrien Brody's man or woman, who begins obsessed on repute and fortune, ends up devastated by means of what he discovers. The emotional toll of the case forces him to rethink his life and leads him to forestall chasing headlines and start being attentive to his family. Years later, George Reeves's image again in the 2023 DC film The Flash, wherein a computer-generated version of him as Superman briefly appeared on display. Whilst it was intended as a tribute, some enthusiasts were not happy with the CGI model, feeling it did not sit proper, specifically given the tragic and complex tale behind the man who first brought Superman to lifestyles. George Reeves lived a lifestyles complete of sharp turns, a few thrilling, some heartbreaking. He commenced off chasing his dream with huge hopes, and at times it appeared like he had surely made it. He had attraction, proper seams, and talent. Humans smiled once they saw him on screen. Children looked up to him. However, behind the scenes, George changed into frequently searching for something greater. Extra respect, extra freedom, greater meaning. He wasn't just the person in the cape. He played guitar, sang, toured the country, and tried difficult to show he can be greater than just one position. He gave back, confirmed kindness, and in no way acted like he became too large for anyone. But, regardless of all that, he frequently felt trapped, boxed in by using an industry that enjoyed him as Superman, however didn't recognize what to do with the person underneath. His story is not pretty much how he died. It is about how he lived within the shadows of the fame he earned. The applause, the smiles, the superhero cape, the ones had been handiest part of his reality. The other component become quiet, complicated, and frequently lonely. Nowadays, human beings still speak about George Reeves, no longer just because of how his life ended, however because they see something real in him. A person looking to count. A man who supposed more to fanatics than he probably ever realized. And perhaps it is the part that remains with us. The concept that a person who once felt invisible remains remembered, still commemorated, and nevertheless matters to such a lot of Thank you for sticking round and getting into the tale of George Reeves with us. His existence became full of highs and lows, fame and frustration. But his legacy as Superman and as a man nonetheless touches people even a long time later. If you discovered this story exciting, heartbreaking, or eye-opening, keep in mind to just like the video. And in case you want more deep explorations into Hollywood legends, untold stories, and proper behind-the-scenes mysteries, make sure to join the channel and hit that notification bell so you by no means miss an ad. Until next time, take care and bear in mind, no longer all heroes wear capes.